In 1301, in the ancient city of Padua, 20 miles inland from Venice, a painter of unprecedented originality was at the height of his powers. Giotto was born over 700 years ago. His clarity and profound observation, the way he painted the world, human beings and natural phenomena, remain potent to this day. In 1986, a space probe called Giotto after him was launched into outer space to examine closely the nature of Halley's Comet and to take pictures of it. In 1301, Giotto had observed and painted the same comet, which approaches Earth infrequently but regularly every 70 years. He painted it on the wall of a chapel in Padua, in a fresco about 6 foot by 6 foot 6, which shows the infant Jesus and the wise men bearing gifts. The fresco is one of 34 that form a huge narrative picture sequence. 3 rows of frescoes start high above our heads, packing the walls and soaring upwards in a long, narrow building that's more than 40 feet tall. At Padua, he painted his masterpiece. Giotto was born near Florence and died there. We know very little about the man, but we can see what he did. Begin to understand his achievement in 3 great cities, in Florence, Padua, and Assisi. It was at Assisi, the little city halfway up the mountain spine of the country, where St. Francis of Assisi was born, that, according to Italian tradition, Giotto began to show human beings, human stories, in a wholly fresh light. 75 years after St. Francis' death, his followers felt a special need for pictures. St. Francis of Assisi, who died at 45 in the year 1226, had been not only a representative, but a living representation of Christ. Yet paintings were still as the Eastern Church ordained, tokens of reverence, gaunt and still. Less than 10 years after St. Francis' death, when hundreds of people still remembered him, this picture by Berlinghieri was the best that Greek-style painting could do to recapture the man as he was. The friars at Assisi needed something that didn't exist. They were full of Francis' sense of what was around him. They still saw the world afresh and alive through his eyes. But these birds never flew. The Franciscans needed narrative painting that compelled enthusiasm for their order. So they fetched to Assisi, to the great forcing house of the new art, painters who worked in the logical and natural-looking style fostered in Rome since antiquity. They were determined that their new church should tell the Franciscan story for everyone with eyes to see. The scale and scope of the St. Francis series at Assisi were quite new. In 28 life-size pictures round the nave, the saint's life was unfolded with continuous vividness. While Giotto was still alive, he and nobody else was credited with the invention of the new painting. But to ask who these pictures were by, as we ask in a modern exhibition, may be missing the point. Here at Assisi, several painters were evidently working together. It's impossible to be certain which pictures, if any, he actually painted himself. In some, I think, one can detect his presence most strongly. St. Francis, a rich man's son, renounced all his worldly goods, but he didn't renounce the world. Just the opposite. He cherished it. St. Francis had a practical faith in the life to come and an all-embracing love for his fellow creatures, a love of the here and now. The Pope, who had endorsed St. Francis and authorized his order, dreamt of him heaving up the tumbling church on his massive shoulders. 8 years later, the first Franciscan to be elected Pope immediately set about fulfilling that. This fresco at Assisi is a picture of the faith and the human strength that were to make painting strong. This heroic view of man supported the church and the whole new art that served it. Following the story of Francis, we soon discover that painting itself is concerned with the real world as never before. On his journey, the saint dismounts just at the convergence of two very real hillsides, where he gives his cloak to the impoverished knight he meets. The painter could see the natural world for the first time. He painted the trees in the crevices between the rocks and the corner of Assisi on the hill. Natural pigments were used for colour, brushed straight into the wet plaster. Some came from the earth itself, red ochre and yellow ochre and lime white. The black was lamp black. Flesh was painted with the ochres and lime white. It was modelled with terra verde, a green earth. The blue was made from vegetable indigo or from the mineral azurite, which could only be used on dry plaster and therefore tended to flake. At the other end of the church, by the doorway, the same painter produced two more pictures of this new kind, which we now call landscapes. One is the miracle of the spring. Though it wasn't the miracle that impressed the age that followed so much as the discovery of naturalness. Vasari, the biographer who invented art history, recorded that one of the most beautiful scenes is of a man showing signs of great thirst, kneeling at a fountain. The incident is conveyed so movingly, Vasari went on, that one might be looking at a real person. On the other side of the door, there's another of these concentrated and noble collaborations with nature, St. Francis preaching to the birds. Between them one looked straight out at a sloping meadow. Here the spirit is as simple and delightful as grass itself. The painter of St. Francis imagined the solidity of the man who leant over his curious audience to engage its attention. Since antiquity, no one had given a figure such bulk. The real gravity of every kind is measured by the light that catches it at shoulder and hip. It begins to bathe them like the light of nature. The saint is a poised epitome of harmony with the whole created world. And the painter caught the birds on the wing at last. Soon after the frescoes here were completed, Giotto was in Padua. Padua, then as now, was a centre of learning. With the greatest university, school of anatomy. He had received a commission from a rich banker, Enrico Scrovegni, who was seeking forgiveness for his father's sin as a moneylender. His father's sin was notorious. In Dante's Inferno, he was singled out by name among the damned. Scrovegni had built a private chapel on the site of a Roman arena, and it was to be filled with pictures. The building, just as we see it still, and its presentation are shown in a Last Judgment on the west wall. The whole chapel was a bid for mercy. Round the walls, Giotto set himself the task of painting a story that people would see as true, true to life and true to man's hope for salvation. With Giotto, everything is embodied in wall painting. Not simply painting on a wall, but painting that is the wall, an integral part of a building, sharing its structural identity. Solidity and strength shine through it. A team of assistants certainly helped with the work in Padua, but the 34 pictures on the walls of this chapel were mostly painted by Giotto himself. The top row of frescoes follows a traditional account of the life of the Virgin Mary. The first scene shows at once the gravity and force of the tremendous story that begins with events leading to the miraculous birth of Mary and ends with the death and resurrection of Christ. Joachim, expelled from the temple because he was childless, doesn't return home to his wife, who's to be the mother of Mary. Instead, deeply shamed, he goes to live in the wilderness with these shepherds. In his misery, he sees neither his dog nor his shepherds, whose sidelong glance of embarrassment is one of the first strokes of genius in narrative art. Meanwhile, an angel tells Anna of the miraculous birth to come. Spinning goes on in the house regardless. Unshakable physical presence and divine intervention are not seen as at all incongruous. In a wintry dream, an angel tells Joachim to go to Jerusalem where Anna will meet him as a sign that she is to bear a child. There at the Golden Gate, when husband and wife meet, their bodies come together in a fulfilling embrace. Her hand caresses his cheek. From within the city, their attendants watch them full of joy. For the first time in the whole of painting, Giotto shows human tenderness. These are pictures of human relationships. The community is built into Giotto's art. From this time on, every systematic style is an implicit image of a society. Here, the figures and setting alike form a single social structure. The character of this work is deeply physical. The light in the pictures falls in the same direction as the real light that shines along the chapel from the windows above the door. On the right-hand wall of the chapel, the light falls from the right, and the left gable of St. Anne's house is in shadow. On the opposite wall, the child to be called Mary is born. Here the real light falls from the left and appears to fall on the painted gable. The illusion, the pictures themselves, take on an existence of their own in the real space. The subject is also an object, and it receives the real light. Giotto wanted to paint a new kind of image with new qualities. He wanted to put more in a picture. In particular, he wanted to put more into a head, more human information. Giotto made a drawing for each picture and copied it on the rough plaster on which the smooth plaster for painting was to be spread. Then he would mark out the areas that he could paint in a day and number them. His procedure generally was to work from left to right and top to bottom. Each morning, the plasterers laid on only the area of smooth plaster that Giotto could paint before evening. Each area of fresh plaster slightly overlaps the preceding section, so one can detect the order in which the wall was plastered and then painted. Giotto did a marvelous first day's work. It gave the atmosphere for the whole picture, established the clear direction of the light falling from the window above the chapel door, and set the precision and grace of style. The second day carried the same structure and the deep blue sky across to the other side of the picture. The setting was largely established, and with it the top of the head of the humble worshipper who was to be blessed. On the third day, Giotto painted the venerable priest who blessed him, and while he was doing so, he realized that his plan had a defect. Right in the middle of the design, the blessing was to be received by less than half a head. So the next day, Giotto painted more of the worshipper's head, including his nose and mouth, and less of the wall below. Then he had the relatively easy task of filling in the space under the pulpit. On the sixth day, he painted the intense and purposeful head of the second priest. The seventh was left for the stricken Joachim, one of the most sorrowful heads ever painted. On the eighth day, he painted two full-length figures from shoulder to toe and brought them together in a vital relationship. It remained to complete the step with its marble riser, which brings it forward to the picture plane and carries it back again into the distance. On the 10th day, the picture was finished. If he took 2 days' rest at weekends, the job, which began the chapel, was finished in a fortnight. A fortnight's work of a kind that changed painting forever. With this revolution in working method, Giotto could realize as never before the whole meaning of narrative and the imaginative response that it stirred in him. These almost square pictures adjust themselves to the rectangle of the frame in a way that still affects painting today. A sheep turns and stretches out of the painted scene into our space, to graze across the decorative border. The shepherd following Joachim only half enters the framed picture and reminds us again that life goes on outside each episode of the painted story. From the tiny spool of thread in the lower left-hand corner to the angel on the right, a strong diagonal sweeps up to brace the image and link together divine purpose and the smallest concerns of the everyday world. The middle row of frescoes shows the birth, childhood, and ministry of Christ. A barn in the mountains as a shelter. We realize all over again that Giotto was the greatest of narrative painters, and not only because he was the first. Who else ever imagined so well the mother's solicitude? The husband's exhaustion. Joseph, like Joachim, was very much a man of this world. The shepherds, who've come to adore the infant, are quite distracted by the frolicking angels. There's nothing pompous about this adoration. Yet the same little Dutch barn becomes a sumptuous place of pilgrimage. An attendant in the royal party has to take a firmer hold on the enthusiastic camel. It's at the same altar from which Joachim was cast away that Christ's parents present him to his sacred destiny. A sturdy prophetess speaks to all of them that looked for redemption. Solid men and women stand upright, their feet firmly planted a prudent distance apart. Clothes fall straight from the shoulder in parallel folds. Human beings are vertical and parallel with one another, sharing a common voluminous nature. The flight into Egypt. These refugees march in the measured tread of a ceremonious procession. The donkey can be depended on. At the massacre of the innocents, the brute wears a workaday balaclava helmet. Dying, the infant victims are tangled underfoot. The baptism of Christ, an arduous mission, and the powerfully foreshortened angel shows the strength of inspiration that informs it. The raising of Lazarus. A man rises from the dead and a workman bends to his task. Giotto paints both in the same scene, both as matters of fact. Christ's ministry leads back to Jerusalem. Another ceremonious procession, but this time no refuge is in prospect. Is there a premonition on Palm Sunday? It's 5 days until his crucifixion. Christ expels the money changers from the temple. A scared child is still curious. No fury was ever so gravely judged and so just. Outside in the porch, a sinister consultation makes a point about the venality of the priesthood. This man has to be stopped, if only because he interferes with trade. On the chancel wall, a priest takes action and hires a traitor. The devil behind Judas is alert, ingratiating, horribly playful. On the bottom row, the Last Supper leads to the passion and resurrection of Christ. With what surprise and with what love they see him wash their feet. Giotto is never unmindful of practical details. Betrayal. Torches, bludgeons, and pikes move up through the darkness, and suddenly they're all around the disciples and their master. The treachery is done with a kiss, and the priest's hand, a soft hand of great delicacy, is the hand of accusation. Lilac, scarlet and gold crowd each other and congest the night. A soldier muffled in a weatherproof seizes Peter's garment to pull him away, but Peter has already struck out with his dagger at Malchus, the high priest's servant. It was the cruelest kiss that we know of. With a reed for scepter and thorns for crown, Christ is seated in the common hall while a whole band of soldiers gather round to mock and beat him. The Romans despair of such justice. Yet Giotto paints nothing without a stillness at its heart, The tragic inevitability of what must happen makes the room almost calm. Even the tormentors are a kind of victim. The way of redemption is pictured step by step. And it was the third hour, and they crucified him. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre. There laid they Jesus. The Lamentation was Giotto's crowning masterpiece. The absolute control and refined simplicity of the language for grief that he learned from ancient sculpture was his alone. The horizontals are the lines that carry the human emotion, the features that convey the intensity of feeling cut across the faces like straight slits. In the vertical dimension, the lines of garments give the figures the stature of the roles divinely ordained for them. In the whole chapel, the horizontal sequence tells the earthly story. The vertical order makes visible the divine purpose. Looking at the flagellation and at the massacre of the innocents above it, we notice that scenes of cruel aggression come over one another. The two scenes of kneeling in humility are coupled together, the adoration and below it the washing of the feet. The baptism, which inaugurated Christ's ministry, comes above the crucifixion, which begins the everlasting atonement. The two-way relevance is most subtly designed. These packed walls are a concentrated argument developed from medieval thought that created the axes of meaning along which we walk in a cathedral. This chapel in Padua was built as an act of atonement in the hope, which was uncertain, of forgiveness in the life to come. What is certain is that Giotto's frescoes here deepen man's understanding of life on earth. In his last years, before he died at 60, Giotto became architect to the cathedral and city of Florence, and the respected leader of Tuscan art. Florence, the energetic and enterprising place that was and is the intellectual capital, demanded more and got more from its citizens. It was his native city. He designed the cathedral bell tower. And he painted 2 chapels in the Franciscan church of Santa Croce. Once more, St. Francis renounces all worldly possessions. The Franciscan story had been Giotto's starting point, and he was to paint scenes from it again at the end of his life. The death of St. Francis. The frescoes here have been badly damaged by time and by overpainting, which has now been carefully removed. Yet even the fragments of Giotto's frescoes that remain show the grandeur of his view, accompanied by an equally incomparable simplicity. The simple love of the friars for their founder. The humanity that the Franciscans required from art and bequeathed to the whole later history of Western painting.